when you start talking about the Zimbabwean film industry, your first impression is always nothing. It's just a tabula rasa, it's an empty slate. Like Tom was joking earlier, I was talking to Ezekiel Mtasa, and I said, oh, look, if you Google the paper that I wrote on the Zimbabwean film industry, I think it's the first result that comes up. And Tom laughed and said, if you say Zim film industry, sounds like fake news, right? And that's the first impression you get. When I got interested in the local film industry, it sounded like, no, there's no such thing as a film industry. But when you got to actually interact on a day-to-day basis with the practitioners, script writers, actors, the producers, the funders, you realize, look, there is a film industry, but it's not so visible. It's fragmented. You find it in different places. It's all over the place. And anyway, you have to look at what's your definition of a film industry. So it also depends on how you define a film industry. And if you apply the definition of a film industry that you use for, let's say, the British film industry or the French film industry or even the South African film industry, you might say, yeah, there isn't such a thing as a film industry. But then you also need to ask other questions about the film industry. Issues not just to do with, is there a film commission, are there studios there, but are there films being made? And yes, I did find that there were lots of films being made by a corpus of very dedicated filmmakers, and those films reaching their intended audiences. And there was an element of that, particularly towards between after 2010, 2013, 2015, and so on. You could see, particularly with films that were being made and were going straight to DVD, that audiences were actually starting to engage with the Zimbabwean films. And so, sort of, what I would like to just speak about is how, sort of, give an outline of our industry here, whether it is a proper industry or not, but what is there and what to me confirms that important work is being done. To give an outline and then say, but what next? And also to outline what the key sort of talking points have been and the key highlights. So our film industry actually starts in the colonial era. Film starts as, particularly the film that has morphed into what is there today, starts as an industry that has colonial origins, that was meant under the colonial, sort of the Central African Film Unit. The idea was to use film as propaganda, basically to teach the so-called natives about hygiene, about law and order, about disease, about bilharzia, kwashiorkor, and things like that. So you saw films like Wives of Nendi, Benzi Goes to Town, films that were about, don't go to town, just stay in the village, and because there's nothing there in the urban area and things like that. So films for Africans were made with that particular propaganda function in mind. And after the end of Federation, with UDI, film fell under the Ministry of Information at the time, and films were purely made for the war effort, because that is when the liberation struggle was happening. And you saw films that were being made about the terrorists in the bush. Film was being made as a hearts and minds kind of filmmaking. The few white people, the Rhodesians, white Rhodesians would watch a different kind of film. They would, of course, watch Hollywood film, and then there would be films made on 35mm that were for tourist purposes, to attract Europeans to come and stay in Zimbabwe. But the films that were being made on 16mm were being made for propaganda purposes. And this after UDI, with the beginning of the war in 1966 and so on, films were made to win the hearts and minds of the natives. After 1980, and at the time, that's when they had Central Film Laboratories, which was right here, where Ziftesa is. It became a UNESCO school in the 90s, and then Central Film Laboratories was this very sort of specialized sort of institution with editing facilities, state-of-the-art 35mm production facilities. But it prescribed the vision of film as something that a talented tenth could only do or make. So you couldn't just make film, because we know how hard it is to make films on celluloid, whether 8mm, 16mm, or 35mm. So film was never meant in this country, was never meant for everyone or anyone. It was meant for particular people. So after 1980, we saw the government jump into film big time. They invited lots of Hollywood films to shoot here. So the government deliberately marketed Zimbabwe as a location. So we saw films like Cry Freedom being shot here with the young Denzel Washington. We saw Clint Eastwood, White Hunter, Black Heart. We saw Last King of Scotland, and so on. And the idea for the government was to use not just this country, market the country as a location, but also to use that basis to try to train a core of African filmmakers who would then take over. So it was actually a good vision to say, let's use these films. So people like Godwin Mauru, Stephen Chigorimbo, Isaac Mabikwa, and so on actually got their break working as, assistant producers, assistant cinematographers, and so on those Hollywood films. But then the government, I think, it overplayed its hand, because then it invested about $5.5 million in Cry Freedom, and it got banned. It made a huge loss. And from that time of Cry Freedom, the government turned its back on the film industry. It never got involved directly or indirectly afterwards. And that has persisted to this day. So there is no state involvement in the film industry in Zimbabwe for many reasons. But if you look at as late as 2013 with the government document called Zim Asset, there was no mention of film at all. And you don't even have a film commission, you don't even have a film body that looks at film and filmmakers. You have National Arts Council, which just looks at arts as a generality. You have the Culture Fund, which also funds, the arts as a generality, not just film. So there is little or no state intervention in the film industry. But this is not just something that is typical of Zimbabwe, it's typical of most African countries, with the exception of South Africa. But even there, there's a unique history there that starts during apartheid, with support for propaganda films. And so when the government turned its back on the film industry with the debacle of Cry Freedom, NGOs came in to fill the void. So Media for Development International literally became the new parent of filmmaking in the country. Although there was some independent filmmaking happening at the time, but literally sort of John and Louis Riba's outfit really helped put Zimbabwe film on the map. So we know films like Neria, Everyone's Child, Consequences, More Time, Yellow Card, and so on, Manaskana, and several other documentaries like Faces of AIDS and so on, were all made under the auspices of MFDI. But the NGO film, what I call the NGO film, as important as it was in keeping filmmaking happening locally, was limited because he who pays the piper calls the tune. So the tune was literally being called by the NGOs, Pathfinder International, Population Services, Anglo-American, Rockefeller International. All these NGOs that were putting money into the films also wanted their themes delivered, themes about social change, about gender issues, inheritance disease, and so on. With the beginning of the fast track land reform program, most NGOs shut shop and left the country. MFDI went back to Tanzania. Well, not went back to Tanzania, but they relocated to Tanzania. But Tanzania is the birthplace of colonial film with what was called the Bantu Educational Cinema Experiment. So it's almost ironic that's where MFDI went after they relocated. So since 2000, I think that's when we actually saw the government has turned its back, NGOs have turned their back, the private sector have never really been involved in making films in Zimbabwe. You see scattered efforts. They say Barclays Bank, I think they put money in yellow card and things like that. But there's never really been support from the private sector for the film industry. So after 2000, you see the film industry is literally orphaned. No government interest, no private sector interest, and no NGO support. So what happens? This is where you find the Zimbabwe International Film Festival trust really coming into its own, particularly with the SPF, the Short Film Project, which many filmmakers participated in. Tawanda Gunda, Brighton Tazarurwa, John Jagu, Yokai Ndarimani, many filmmakers, the younger generation, most of them under 40, participated in those ZIF projects. And people started finding out that, we can do this. You don't need to be part of the elite to make films. You don't need 35 millimeter. And video helped. The example of video helped. So since 2000, that's where we start to see the birth of what I would say a true Zimbabwean film industry, because now it's not just people who have been given the specific and special skills to do 35 millimeter who are doing film. It's literally everyone who feels that they've got a story to tell and they've got enough dedication who started making film. And film industry is a lot about volume. You can't make one film every 9 years and expect to have a film industry, right? If one swallow does not make a summer, one film does not make a film industry. So we see the volume really increasing after that time, largely because of video, making film becomes cheaper, and so on. After 2010, with the economic, before that, of course, with the economic collapse, and with sort of the flux that is there in the country economically and politically, you start to see a lot happening where the economy in Zimbabwe becomes informal, almost like a shadow economy. So there is a lot around what was then called $2, where you literally would, because there were problems with change, you just have to buy whatever you have for $1 and it's doubled, even though you might want one thing but you get twice because there's no change, and so on and so forth. So the $2 model, I would say, arises around that time with a lot of informality and shadow economies, where you start seeing DVDs on the street and you get 2 on a discount, you get 2 DVDs for $1, and so on and so forth. And what are these movies? They're mainly Nollywood. And Nollywood is the first film industry in Africa that really cracked the market, using what's called the straight to DVD model. You shoot a film, put it straight onto DVD, and within days, it's all over the country, it's all over the continent. In other words, filmmakers in Nigeria were learning to pirate their own films, to say, if you can't beat the pirates, join them. And the straight to DVD model made us see Nigerian films for the first time. You can go to Ukraine today, you can go to London, you can go to Italy, you see Nigerian films there. You can go into the British Airways, onto Emirates, you watch Nollywood films there. So they managed to do something that African film has struggled with, which is distribution. How do you crack the market? How do you get the film to reach the people for whom you make the films, the audiences for which you intend to watch a film? Neria was a very good film. It outdid Terminator, it's Kineko and so on. But it did not reach the majority of Zimbabweans, as important a film as it was. And so distribution remains a problem here. Most cinemas are closing or have closed. Kineko is hardly interested in local films. So there's a limit to trying to just make a film because I'm going to put it in the cinemas. So we need to think about how do we reach audiences. A few years ago, Salon.com did something that was very unique by partnering with Geo Magazine, getting their money beforehand, and then giving the film for free with the magazines. So there's an importance in thinking about how do we reach our audiences, because making a film putting it on a shelf where it gathers dust, that's a waste. And so we need to start thinking about these models of distribution. In South Africa, there's a big and important film industry, but still they haven't cracked the market. There's a duopoly there of Stay Kineko and New Metro. Unless Stay Kineko and New Metro take your film, how do you get it to the audiences? And so we saw with the Maluputu films in South Africa, where the films were on DVD, the films by Chico Twala, and most South Africans in the townships watched those films. And we see the same thing with the Mr. Bones films, by the Hofmeyer films, Leon Schuster. You might like them, you might not. They are borderline racist, perhaps racist, but they get to audiences. What is he doing right that we are not doing right? You see them in India, they are loved. The Leon Schuster films, they are loved in India. So how do these films, like the Chico Twala films, like the Mr. Bones films, like the Lokshin Baskop films, how do they get to the audiences? How do we have a film industry? So these are questions that I think are important to our own local film industry. But we know that the issue of funding is key. But what sort of funding? Because I think going to funders with a begging power for me is a limited model. It will not get us anywhere. It didn't get us anywhere with any NGO films. So what are the options that are open? What sort of funding mechanisms can we apply? And so I think the dialogue that is going to open here and at this film festival is largely to do with how do we have an organic funding model? How do we find ways of doing our films and distributing them that appeal to our people, to our culture, to our storytelling cultures, but also to our means as well? And you never know, a few years to come we'll be watching Zimbabwean films on British Airways and Emirates, and why not? So with that, I think I'll shut up for now, and I don't know who's next, Mona Lisa.